We're going to start pretty directly the English Reformation this evening. I do have a little bit of background to get to the Reformation, but I would like to keep in mind the central, the central question of this study, and that is, how do we come into a a proper, a good, a redeemed, a loving, a forgiven, relationship with God? Or to say it more briefly, how do we enter into the life of salvation? How do we experience His grace, His mercy, and how do we know that we are in that kind of relationship? Those sorts of questions lie at the heart of what brought about the Protestant Reformation. And we looked at Martin Luther, for example. He's going to be influential in the story that I'll try to tell this evening. But that question it's a live question, and it was a very lively question then, because some of the difficulties and challenges and mistakes and wrongdoings of the church, which was the Roman Catholic Church, had really become so evident to people in a widespread way that there was a lot of discontent. Now, if you think of it like this, so I've been following the practices of the church. This might actually be a little too relevant for right now. I've been following the practices of the church. I'm now starting to see that the people in authority who've been telling me these things might not be trustworthy. Maybe they've told me something wrong. And come to think of it, I don't exactly feel like I'm experiencing forgiveness or God's love or anything like that. And so how do I know I'm actually saved? Just to use kind of modern, a modern way of asking that. How do I know? And, it's either heaven or hell. I'm either going to heaven or I'm going to hell. How do I know which road I'm on? This really it's an important question, and it was a kind of re-emerging question in a way because of all the complications, the challenges, the difficulties, the inconsistencies, the injustices, the power plays of people high up in the Roman Catholic Church. So this quote from A.G. Dickens' book on the English Reformation, medieval English religious life. Now, so everything I just said applies to England, really applies across Europe, but certainly England. He says that the widespread efforts to attain salvation through devout observances, it's the stuff we do, right? Emphasis on saints, relics, and pilgrimages. That's what was being emphasized. And as he says here, the personality and the teaching of Jesus was receding. So the church is the authority. The church is in the place of Christ. The Pope, as the vicar of Christ, has the authority. And that's what's kind of come to the foreground. It's what the church says, if I could say it this way, rather than what Jesus says. It's what the church says is the way to go. The church is telling me I need to do these things, and I'm doing these things, but I'm still not sure if it's enough. That's kind of the question that is plaguing people.
So did the least among them, when you look at what they're doing, that takes some power and money. You can't just go off on a pilgrimage if you've got your fields
Right.
or whatever.
Right.
So it looks like this was tilted toward the rich and famous and well-to-do, and the serfs were toast.
Some actions were tilted toward the powerful and the wealthy. For example, indulgences.
Right.
If you And I've only told us a little slice about the indulgences. It's actually that indulgence idea gets carried out in lots of different ways. So if I've got the money, for example, in England, this is one of the things that people did. If I have money, I can build a chantry. I can build a little chapel-like building. I can hire a priest whose job it is to pray for me, to celebrate the Mass again and again and again and again, and I'll pay him, and his prayer on my behalf will reduce my time in purgatory. If I don't have any money, I can't do that, right? I may be able to do some other things, but the question, what can I do to sort of better position myself, right, was a really kind of powerful question.
Is that you get out of purgatory by your works?
No, you don't really get out by your you get out of purgatory by undergoing the punishment that you deserve. And so a priest praying for you, celebrating the sacrament, receiving, the body and blood of our Lord on your behalf. It's like you are brought into the grace of God by virtue of this priestly action, and that action applies to the forgiveness you need to get out of purgatory. Yeah.
The priest doesn't like you to that.
Right. And I do want to, I mean, that's true. If the priest had power, I want to say two things here. The people were just generally sincere believers. What we don't have is a bunch of skeptical, I'm not really, we don't have modern people who are skeptical, individualistic, spiritual, but not religious. I mean, if you believe that the Christian life is the way to heaven, you want to get on that way and you want to do it right. And now, now it looks like it's a lot easier to do it all wrong than it is to get it right. And so people are very loyal to the church and loyal to these practices, but they're also beginning to see the inequities and the hypocrisies and the naked power plays. And I'll try to give enough of a picture of how the church really had a lot of political governmental power, particularly in England, that will maybe add to the picture of, so you've got the bishop who's a religious leader, but he's also a prince, and he has power. He controls land, he controls money, he can even control like small militaries, right? He can do all kinds of things, a lot of power. Okay, so the bullet points, the church did have much land, wealth, and power. So wealthy people gave land to the church. When they died, their wills. So monasteries, some of the monastic houses in England became very wealthy, very powerful. Sometimes a wealthy landowner would set up a monastery and then in old age would retire to live there. So these monasteries could be like little, well, and like little, not exactly tourist places. It's not like that, but places of ease. The monks did the work, right? The monks did the work. But, that house had a lot of money. They owned land. They were making money from the produce of the land. And so, when you have money and land, you have interest in the way things go. You have interest in what the government decides to do, all that. So one way, I think, an important way to think about this is within the religious structure, you have a lot of worldly concerns and worldly interests and worldly activities. For example, in the parliament, the bishops, if you're a bishop in the Catholic Church, You are a member of the House of Lords. That's the upper chamber of Parliament. So there's the House of Lords, the House of Commons. House of Lords, they're the aristocrats. Money, land, wealth, all that. Bishops are in the House of Lords. So they're helping to govern the nation. I mentioned the land holdings of monastic orders. Priests in their parishes collected tithes from the people. So they got the tithe, and they gave some of that money to the bishop, and the bishop gave some of that money to a monastery or a school, or we're spreading the wealth around. But if I'm living in this area, I'm a member of this parish, and the priest has a right to exact a tithe from me. I'm not giving it voluntarily. Now they did, again, sincere Christian people are willingly giving, but it was also required, and it could be demanded and even forced. Another example of the worldly power of the church during this time in England is that they ran courts. So capital murder was something that I'll call them secular courts, the king's courts would oversee, but marriage and divorce, adultery, other forms of immorality, you might say lower level crimes, but stuff that you deal with every day, they're taken care of in the ecclesiastical courts. Well, what does that mean? That means that a monk or a priest is the judge, right? So again, power. Now, if I'm living in a village, and this England is incredibly rural. The period of time we're talking about right now, London has about 50,000 people. And there are 3 other cities, towns. Let's see, it's Norwich. I'm forgetting what, Bristol, I think, maybe. There are like 3 towns with 5,000 to 10,000 people. Everybody else is living in villages. Many of them, you got 100 people in this little hamlet. So everything is face to face. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows everybody's business. And the local parish, church, and priest so much revolves around that structure. And so, you go, if you get in trouble and you have to go to court, you may live in this village, you may be going 5 miles away to the town, where the court is, but church has a lot of power, a lot of power. Now, reformers before the Reformation in England. You were looking at John Wycliffe in this picture. Sometimes, some people say John Wycliffe. You see his date. So he lives in the 14th century. He was a professor at Oxford University. And I won't dwell on him except to say he had lots of what we would think of as Protestant Reformation ideas. For example, Scripture is the only authority, the only and final authority. He was very much against papal power. He argued against transubstantiation. Now, in the 14th century, this is really amazing. He believed that priests should be able to get married. He believed in having the Scripture in the vernacular, in this case, English. He didn't like, again, he wasn't against monks. He was against the monastic system as it had become, big houses, lots of land and money. And, the abbot of the head of the house has a lot of power, and power is corrupting. So, Christians are supposed to watch that. Well, the church had just kind of climbed in bed with all this wealth and power, and they didn't seem to be too bothered by it. And Wycliffe is one that, tried to make a correction. So as you see here, the only Protestant doctrine he did not anticipate was justification by faith alone. And he developed some followers. He was a well-educated Oxford scholar. and he developed a little following. They were called Lollards. So when you read in English history, the reference to Lollards is very common, and that word means mumblers. So some of Wycliffe's followers, not formally theologically trained, would stand on the street corner and preach. And this Lollards were never a big group, and they were often like the oppressed minority. But they created attention, created a little stir, and they're convinced that what Wycliffe said was right and that the church needed to be reformed in these ways. Some of them actually became members of parliament. So, these are not the lowest level in society people. They're in the kind of the artisan and the commercial class and the people, or the yeoman farmers who have some land and can produce an income and have some substance. They get into the House of Commons in Parliament, and they put forward these proposed legal enactments called the 12 Conclusions that basically rejected what Wycliffe rejected: transubstantiation, the veneration of physical objects, prayers for the dead, pilgrimages, images, etc. So it was something of a people's movement, but the leaders of the church and the leaders of the government were very vigilant about it, and they would come down hard on people who were Lollards. So now Lollards had influence, but they never became a big movement, like a big, the kind of movement that could overthrow a government, like the later Puritans actually did. Now, I have him on here. He's a big part of the story, but again, there's so much to this story, I can't tell you. I put Cardinal Thomas Wolsey on here as an example of the melding of religious and political power. So he's a cardinal. He is the legate. He's the highest Catholic official in England. So he's a personal representative of the Pope. And he is King Henry VIII's like number 2 guy. So he's a religious leader who is a personal advisor to the king. And of course, he's a stalwart Catholic, and he's vigilant about these reforming tendencies. Now we're into the 1500s here, so I jumped a lot of time. But Wolsey falls out of favor with Henry because he's unable to secure the annulment from Henry's wife Catherine that Henry wants, and we'll get into that story. But that got him out of favor. He was actually convicted of treason and would have been executed, but he died before he was executed. So he died, sort of in shame. Another figure from this time who has a lot of influence is William Tyndale. You can see his dates there. A brilliant linguist. Yeah, he was fluent in 7 languages. He translated the New Testament from the Greek. He left England because, Protestant Reformation ideas were not popular at this period of time. And he went to the Netherlands, as it says here, very influenced by Luther's thought. In his New Testament translation, in his marginal notes, and in other parts of the Bible, he includes Lutheran ideas, and he makes very anti-papal comments in some of these ideas. And so he's one who gets caught up in the controversies of the day. His English translation was really good. It became one of the sources for the authorized version, the King James Version. And he was betrayed by a person who claimed to be a friend. was arrested in the Netherlands and taken to Brussels for trial and was convicted and executed.
And he was convicted of, I read about him today for some reason, it came up on something I was reading, but what was he convicted of?
Well, it was heresy. He was a heretic. Yeah, he was considered a heretic, and yeah. Yep. From another source that I've been consulting, we're getting to Henry VIII now. I got some pictures to show you. Between 1527 and 1534, by an act of sheer political will, King Henry VIII compelled a proudly, loyally Catholic country to renounce the papacy, accept him as the supreme head of the church, and join him in defying the man who was now only to be described as the Bishop of Rome, talking about the Pope. He's not the Pope, he's just the Bishop of Rome, just like all the other bishops. But I mean, I'm not sure I could convey how shocking this move is. So that's why I thought this quote was good. By an act of sheer political will. And then this event permanently changed the religious, political, and social history of all the British nations, and it remains mysterious, which he spends his book trying to unpack the mystery. All right, some pictures. Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, he's a Tudor. And he's probably the most famous king of England, certainly one of the most favorites. He was born in 1491, he died in 1547. He was the son of Henry VII, who was really the first Tudor king. So in the way these dynasties go, this is a new dynasty, and it's very unshaky. I mean, it's very shaky, excuse me, unstable. And so Henry is desperate to have a male heir to keep the dynasty going. So he's married to Catherine of Aragon. She's Spanish. She's the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. She is the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. They're all Catholic, of course. Everybody's Catholic in this picture. She had been married to Henry's brother, Arthur, and Arthur died 5 months after they got married. And so Henry marries Catherine, and she has a bunch of miscarriages and one child, a daughter, who actually lives to adulthood. And you can see her there on the right. She will eventually become Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, that we read about. And you see her reign is not a long one. And she's not the next one in the story of who sits on the throne. But she's the first child born that survives. Well, Henry figures out, this is why Cardinal Wolsey fell out of favor. He finally finds someone who figures out how to get Henry out of this marriage. And this is a long, multi-year, drawn-out process. And eventually, Henry marries Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. You can see her dates there as queen. Not long. Anne also does not produce a male heir, but a daughter who becomes Elizabeth I. And she reigns a long time, and we'll come back to her. Anne Boleyn is accused of adultery. And again, there's a lot of, we have some legitimate suspicions. We need this story to be a certain story because I still need a male heir. So, you've got these high status religious and governmental leaders trying to convince the Pope to grant an annulment. They're not getting it. And so now they're going to figure out how to get Henry what he needs and still remain sort of faithfully Christian. That's way oversimplified, but I hope, to get the spirit of the issue across. Okay, so poor Anne Boleyn is beheaded in 1536, and Henry marries Jane Seymour. She's queen for 4 years. And she actually dies she has a son, finally, he has a male heir. She dies from complications in childbirth. And so now she's out of the picture. But now we have a son, Edward VI. He doesn't live very long. He wasn't a really strong child, and he only ruled those, 6 years or so. And he dies. Now, we'll come back to Edward and Mary and Elizabeth in a couple of minutes. Thomas Cromwell, I counted up, he had about 10 different titles as he rose up through the ranks of government. So Thomas Cromwell was not a cleric. You can see his dates there. And these are some of the accomplishments, you might say. He was a member of Parliament. He had several offices in Henry's administration, the last one being chief minister. He was, remember, they're all Catholic. He was influenced by reading Erasmus' Greek New Testament. Cromwell was very well educated, and that helped to incline him toward the Reformation. Now, Cromwell is the one who successfully frees Henry VIII from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And we'll get to this, but basically Cromwell figures out how to convince the British Parliament to pass several legal acts, basically to declare independence from the Pope. And now we're going to have our own church, the Church of England. And Henry VIII is going to be the supreme head of the church. Cromwell is the one who, he has a great legal mind. He has legal training, and he figures out how to do all this and convince Parliament to go along with it. The problem is he's also the one who recommended Henry marry Anne of Cleves. She was I think German. I'm blanking on her background, but they were only married 6 months. It was really tragic, and she basically lived as a single woman. She was taken care of by Henry, but he put her out of his sight, took care of her, but they were only married like 6 months. And this was Cromwell's downfall. He lost his life over that mistake. This guy is really important, Thomas Cranmer. He becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, if you look down kind of in the middle of the list. Again, very well educated, very scholarly. You can see his dates there. He studied at Cambridge University, and Cambridge became sort of a hotbed for Protestant Reformation ideas. Cranmer, again, before he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, is a young up-and-coming scholar and priest. He had been married once. His wife died still young, and so he entered holy orders. So he's traveling around on behalf of King Henry on these diplomatic missions in Germany. And while he's in Germany, he actually meets Andreas Osiander, who's a Lutheran, a German Lutheran. As it says, they're a moderate Lutheran. And Cranmer is familiar with Luther's ideas. He studied at Cambridge, and that's going on while he's at Cambridge. And he falls in love with Osiander's niece, and he marries her. And they marry secretly because he's now an ordained, he's a priest in the Catholic Church. So they marry secretly, but Cranmer has these Protestant ideas. So, he's convinced that priestly marriage or clerical marriage is really okay, but he's also trying to sort of keep his career on track and not get in trouble with people. Now, we'll come back to this too, but Cranmer is important for really the development of the Book of Common Prayer and the liturgy. So many of the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer and the liturgy, the words of the liturgy today are from Cranmer's work. He was actually martyred by Mary I in 1556 in Oxford. I had a picture I took it out, but you can go online, and if you Google Martyrs Square, there's actually a place in Broad Street in Oxford, pavement stones embedded in the street in the shape of a cross. And several of these Protestant reformers were executed under Mary's reign, and they were burned at the stake there on Martyrs Square. And so that's where he gave his life. Now, he actually, it's kind of a side story on Cranmer. He actually reneged on some of his Protestant convictions in order to avoid death. But then some time passes and he thought better of that reneging. He sort of repented of that sin. And so he had written, what's the word I'm looking for? A rebuttal of some of his ideas. And so when he was martyred, he put that hand in the flame first, right? His writing hand that he had written out. There's a word I can't bring it to my mind, but what?
Defense of his writing?
No, but the opposite. So what I wrote was wrong, and now this is my written statement that was wrong, and I renounce what I had written. Renunciation, that's the word. Sorry?
Recantation?
Yeah, recantation. There you go. Well, so he recanted of his recantation. And when he was burned at the stake, he put his hand in there first into the fire as a way of kind of symbolizing his repentance. Anyway, Cranmer is a huge influence in this whole story of the Reformation in England, but that's all we can do now. Okay. As I said, Henry needs a male heir, and Cardinal Wolsey failed at that. Henry remains a convinced Catholic. Henry was somewhat theologically conversant and actually wrote a document about the seven sacraments that was against what Luther had said about the sacraments. They hated each other.
Really?
I think Luther referred to Henry VIII as that pig. So Henry's really Catholic. Now, this is important for the story, how it all winds up in England. He's really Catholic in his convictions, but he needs freedom from papal control. Now, let me just try to lay this out, because this back and forth can be very confusing. Catherine of Aragon, convinced Catholic. Her daughter Mary, who becomes queen, is a devout Catholic and determined to reestablish Catholic primacy in England when she's on the throne. Anne Boleyn is a convinced Protestant. So remember, she's wife number 2 in the picture. And her daughter, Elizabeth, eventually comes to the throne, and she's really Protestant in her commitments and sensibilities, but she's also a very savvy ruler.
Yeah.
And she's trying to manage these political forces roiling around in England. And then there's Jane Seymour, she's by everybody's description was an extremely gentle, caring, kind, quiet person. So I admit to you right now, I've lost track of what her religious views actually were, but it kind of didn't matter because she just just people, everybody just loved her, Now, the interesting thing, the sad thing about Jane Seymour, I guess it's not sad, but before she was put to death, um, no, sorry, she wasn't put to death. She's the one who died with complications from childbirth. She actually helped Henry's daughter Mary get back into good graces with her father Henry, because when Catherine was put away and the marriage was annulled, that made Mary an illegitimate child, right? And so all kinds of humiliation, shame, and frustration and anger, and so estrangement there. But Jane actually helped Henry and Mary reconcile. So we have Catholic, Protestant, you've got, boy, it's messy. Now we got to get Parliament involved. And this is where the Reformation in England starts to take a hold, but it's all, at this point, it's parliamentary, it's legal action, right? Keep in mind that there are these Reformation ideas that have been circulating around, and merchants have been traveling abroad and they've gone to the Netherlands, and people are reading William Tyndale's New Testament. They're being smuggled into England. It's all illegal. They're being smuggled into England. And so people who are literate and people who are interested in, reforming the church, and people who have the money, the means to buy books and read books, and they're traveling, so they're interacting with these ideas. That's what's happening. The aristocrats, the landed wealthy people, they tend to stay conservative. They tend to remain Catholic. It's sort of yeah. Okay, so the Act in Restraint of Appeals is the first parliamentary act passed in England, and it basically declares that the Pope has no jurisdiction in England. None of the priests, none of the bishops can appeal to the Pope for some sort of judgment to resolve any kind of issue in England. It's just a declaration of independence. And then the next year, and this is where Cromwell and his influence is really, really effective. He's very much involved in the construction of these parliamentary acts. The Act of Supremacy declared the monarch, in this case Henry VIII, the supreme head of the Church of England. Not the Pope. The king is the head of the Church of England. Well, of course, Henry likes that. Even though he's Catholic in his religious viewpoints, he likes having the freedom and the power to be in charge. Now, the first attempt at establishing the religious, theological, doctrinal foundations for the Church of England is known as the 10 Articles. They were written in 1536. And just to summarize, you can see, because remember, Henry is the head of the Church of England now, and he's Catholic. So in these articles, you would find faith and works as necessary for salvation. So that's, if we're doing a check the box for the Catholics, right? Transubstantiation is a belief that the Church of England will uphold the real presence of Christ in transubstantiation, in the Mass. Check, that's Catholic. The sacraments are necessary for salvation. Check. But some other Catholic essentials on the continent are not essential anymore. Purgatory. There's no article that says, we believe in purgatory and we think that's part of the future that we all face. So they took out some of what had been essential and made them optional. Okay, as I mentioned, Henry VIII is Catholic, but he needs freedom from the papacy. He dies in 1547. His son, Edward VI, is only 9 years old. And so Edward has, like a co-regent. They're there are a couple of men, and they're highly placed men, who are running the government in his name. And Edward is really brought up in a kind of Protestant Reformed environment. So you see, we go from Catholic, now we're swinging Protestant. So the people in charge of both the king's court, not parliament exactly, but the king's court. Because remember, in parliament, we have the House of Lords with all these bishops. They're not in favor of any of this, and they're not going to be quiet about it. But in the king's court, the inner circle with the king, a lot of Protestant Reformed ideas. The first act of uniformity is passed under Edward VI. By this time, Thomas Cranmer has become Archbishop, and so he has a lot of power. He's the #1 clerical leader in the Church of England. And so he's largely responsible for the Book of Common Prayer. So what we're getting now is the Act of Uniformity says everybody has to follow the beliefs and practices of the Church of England. It's basically illegal now to be Catholic or to be openly Catholic, even though that's still debatable, right? Okay. Edward doesn't live very long. He's 20 years old when he dies, give or take a few months. He dies in 1553. So now we have this Protestant-leaning country, right? Even though it's, a lot of controversy, but the leadership is leading, most of them are leading this way. And then Edward dies and Mary becomes queen. And she's a fervent, devout Catholic, and she is out to get the people that are trying to corrupt this nation. And so for 5 years or so, we have the reign of so-called Bloody Mary. And then she dies, and the country swings the other way with Elizabeth I, who takes the throne in 1558. And we have the Elizabethan settlement, which we will, I think, look at all very briefly. Now, what I'm trying to do is sort of give you a sense of just how topsy-turvy, how unsettled things are, how difficult these situations are. Also, how committed people were to their principles and willing to, advocate for them and risk their lives, like Cranmer and Cromwell, who both very committed to the Reformation and used all their leadership and brilliance, frankly, to pull off the Reformation in England. So to try to gather things together here, you have a collection of parliamentary acts. So you have legal enactments. You have leading people in the right places, like Cranmer, who are convinced reformers. They are Protestant in their beliefs, in their devotion to Christ. They believe that the Protestant way of looking at things is the way, the truth, and the life, right? It's how we know Christ in a saving way. Both Luther and Calvin, their writings are part of the picture in England during this time. And finally, there was enough popular support among the higher ranking people in England, some of these wealthy merchants and commercial people and some of the people close to places of power in the government. So they were able to, kind of have these inside conversations. They could write, they could advocate. So it's really a combination of these three major aspects that brought about the Protestant Reformation in England.
Well, Mary was only queen for 5 years.
Right.
And it was Protestant before her.
Right.
And because she was so strict I don't know.
Yeah.
Where she sought the blood of
Right.
Protestants. But now England was a small country, but still you have no good communications. It would take 2 years probably for some of these decrees to go from the south of England to the Scotland border.
Yeah, it did take time, but they had courier service.
Yeah.
They had a way of getting it, but it could take a few weeks or months. Yeah. And there's always, if you're out in that village of 100 people, you have no idea any of this is going on, right? Until it kind of, finally gets to you.
I
Yeah.
can see how confusing it would be if you were trying to be a devout believer in Jesus.
Yeah.
And you have this guy who, that's how you have to do it.
Right.
And then this guy, this is how you have to do it. And you hear that would be difficult.
Right. Yeah. Imagine being a priest and, the bishop is the one who says, okay, now, this is a crude way of putting it. Okay, guys, now we're doing it this way. Oh, really? Yeah. And if you don't do it this way, we may have your head. It was that kind of a power pressure sometimes. Okay. Boy, we're just flying through this stuff. So we get to Elizabeth I, and really this is where the Protestant Reformation settles in and becomes truly the Church of England that we know today, honestly. Known as the Elizabethan settlement. Another act of uniformity under her reign in 1559 made it illegal to follow a form of Christianity other than the now established church. So you have all these Catholics living in England who now cannot legally practice their religion. You have other Protestants who think the Reformation hasn't gone nearly far enough. And we will look at them in just a second. You'll recognize them immediately. The 10 articles, I skipped some steps here. The 10 articles were reduced to 6 articles a few years after their original formation. They were reduced, but eventually you get 42 articles. And then they are reduced to 39 articles. And the 39 articles of religion of the Church of England are the articles for the Church of England in place today. And for the United Methodists, for the Methodists, there are 24 articles of religion that come almost word for word from the 39 articles. We added the 25th one that establishes our loyalty to the President of the United States and the American government, right? We're not going to be secretly loyal to the King of England. So 25 articles. So the 39 articles are established. Now you can imagine the debates that are going on, the writings that are taking place, the back and forth, and the 39 articles are passed and approved by Parliament. This isn't just a group of church leaders doing this off on a corner. Here's where the Protestant theology really starts to show. So if you look at that right-hand list, salvation by faith alone. No more faith and works. Scripture is the authority, along with creeds. I mean, there's this part of the Anglican way is we recognize the creeds, but there's no magisterium, and there's no, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, the #1 prelate in the Church of England. He doesn't, by the way, the Archbishop of Canterbury is now a she, but the Archbishop does not have disciplinary authority to coerce people to believe or think a certain way, or doesn't have the authority to make a pronouncement that becomes church law. That's all done in the convocation. It's done with all the bishops together. So they have a kind of conciliar, a council way of getting their legal work done. So Scripture alone. The Church of England holds to predestination, but not double predestination. They don't endorse the idea that God decrees some to go to hell, but they do endorse that God predestines some to salvation. They just kind of, that's where the Lutheran influence shows up a little bit, because Luther wasn't willing to sort of take that next logical step that Calvin did. That's why I put predestination, but not double. And then finally, the Church of England recognizes 2 sacraments, not 7. So if you were to pick up a Book of Common Prayer, you would find the 39 articles, you would find all the liturgies of the church, all kinds of prayers. I use the Book of Common Prayer, daily, really. I mean, and some of the prayers in there are prayers that Cranmer wrote. It's really they're beautiful, and there's prayers for healing, all kinds of things in the Book of Common Prayer. And to note, the Book of Common Prayer is Protestant in theology, but look at what we keep from the Catholic Church. We keep the altars, and it's called an altar. We keep priestly vestments. When we lived in Dallas, there's a church, an Episcopal church in Dallas called Church of the Incarnation. It's a wonderful pastoral staff, wonderful congregation. And Joni and I would on occasion go to their early Sunday morning service. And I got acquainted with the head priest and a couple others there. There were some SMU connections, and that's how I got acquainted. And anyway, one time they asked me to preach for them in this church. And I mean, they wear the vestments. Of course, I'm in my plain old, the robe I wear every Sunday, They were all, I just remember standing in the vestry there, the room where they get dressed. And it's actually quite a process to get dressed. Beautiful, but whoa. I mean, it really felt kind of, as they sometimes say, Anglo-Catholic, very high church, which was interesting. But so Church of England keeps priestly vestments. Now, today in the Church of England, there's quite a bit of variety. You can have priests that are very low church, and they don't, they really tone down the way they dress. They still wear a collar. I don't know of any Church of England priest or Episcopal priest who does not wear a collar, but their vestments on a Sunday morning may be very, very minimal, very minimal. So nonetheless, there are priestly vestments, and they refer to the pastor as a priest. They are priests. I just recently read The Christian Priesthood Today by Archbishop Michael Ramsey, he's long dead, but he was an Archbishop of Canterbury. And because I'm kind of curious about some of these things, and the way this kind of Anglican way of thinking about pastoral ministry is priestly in a way that I'm not quite on board. It's just hasn't been the Methodist tradition, and I'm shaped by the Methodist tradition. So, okay, private confession spoken aloud, right? They kept that. And they kept prayers for the dead.
What are prayers for the dead?
I mean, they are literally prayers for people who have died, So this is the kind of the tension, you might say. So we don't believe that people are in purgatory. So prayers for the dead used to be for people in purgatory, and praying for them was a way of reducing their suffering or their time in purgatory. So, and this is where my knowledge of the reason for why keeping it, but part of this, you can just see the need for compromise. You've got a nation fairly still divided, Catholic and Protestant. You've got powerful people in England among the landed classes who remain Catholic. They are not interested in the Protestant Reformation. You've got all these bishops. They were bishops in the church, in the Catholic Church, in the Church of England, but Catholic. But now the Church of England is its own thing. Those bishops don't just flip a switch in their minds and say, okay, we're Protestant now. So these struggles go on. That's why Elizabeth's reign is so interesting for people who really like to dig into the details of the history of this. She's balancing political forces very astutely, and the kind of compromises made in the 39 articles and, you know, in what's known as the Elizabethan settlement is a way of trying to satisfy all the parties involved. That's why the Anglican Church is sometimes called the middle way, or in Latin, the via media. And of course, you know, the Anglicans see this as a strength, and Catholics see it as you're just Catholic light, you know. Now that's a terrible way to put it. And, you know, most Catholics aren't going to say something like that, but that is sort of the attitude that you're sort of playing at being Catholic.
Was transubstantiation still upheld by that point?
No,
Okay,
it's gone.
It was, but then they let it go.
Right, yeah. No transubstantiation. Real presence, but it's not defined in such terms. Okay, so the last question as we do the English version of the Reformation. What if you don't agree with any of this? You know, imagine being a person aware, you have some substance, you know, you have some status and a little bit of clout, and you don't buy any of this. And there were two major groups who didn't. The Catholics, they became known as recusants. They weren't buying this at all. And there were uprisings. There was resistance up in the north of England, especially, you know, kind of the farthest away from London and the closest to Scotland. That was, now Scotland becomes Protestant too, but a lot of Catholics in Scotland and connections to Catholic France and all that. So if you're really a convinced Catholic still, and you know, you're the Lord of a manor up north, you've got something to say about this and you don't like it at all. And you feel like you can say something to people and gather resistance and all that. So there's that group that continue to be active, but now it's illegal for them to practice their Catholic faith openly. They have to comply to the new standards. So again, just to, let me belabor this point. So that church building that was Catholic, where I went all the time for mass and all that, and the priest, and now it's not Catholic. Now it's governed by these beliefs, and I still see the altar, I still see the vestments. We're still doing some of the things, but it's not faith and works, not transubstantiation. That's really a big one. Communion means something totally different now. That would be huge. I'm no longer receiving Christ. I'm not getting the body and blood of Christ, right? Okay, so there's that group. Then there's another group, the reformers, who think this Reformation doesn't go nearly far enough. They want to get rid of altars, priestly vestments, private confession. They want to be more Calvinist. They want to be more Reformed. They eventually are known as Puritans. And a bunch of them left and went to the Netherlands while Mary was queen. Some died, others escaped and were refugees in the Netherlands, and were able to, kind of establish something of a movement there. And so in the 1600s, if we were to carry on this story, we would read about, the English Civil War and the Puritan Commonwealth. The Puritans take over government eventually and all that. And I could mention the name Oliver Cromwell, and some of you would make that connection. So, but that is, the basic story of how the Church of England becomes Protestant. And remember, the fundamental questions are, how do we know we're saved? How do we know we're in a right relationship with God? And that's all being argued out in these kinds of forces and situations and enactments.
Well, even more than the argument, it was affirmed, blatantly affirmed, that if you don't do it this way, you're going to hell. You're going to die,
Right,
and
right,
you are, that's
right,
no question.
right. Yeah, I mean, my sort of a journeyman scholar's conclusion on this, we can see why the mixture of political power and ecclesiastical commitments, why those are not good, right? But we also see it's challenging to me to see people who are ready to die for their faith. They really these ideas are not just academic debates that you can believe one way or the other and it really doesn't amount to much. They think it's a matter of life and death, and I believe we should listen to them that way, even though executing people who don't agree, there have to be some very clear boundaries about that, and that's where
the Protestant movement come down as hard as the Catholic movement on that. I mean, Catholics, there is no doubt, if you die outside of the church, you're wrong. I mean, you're toast, literally.
yeah.
But I don't know if the Protestants, was it that blatant?
Well, I think the answer is no, because from the beginning, Protestants were already a little bit divided in the way they saw certain questions, and they didn't have the same kind of power. I mean, it's not an exactly proportional kind of thing, but if you look at church history, anytime church leaders have the kind of political power and feel the responsibility for large institutions, if they have the ability to use the sword, they will use the sword.
I wonder today, the people that are religious in England, what the percentage is, Church of England versus Catholic.
The Church of England is the legally established church still in England, but the long time ago, the Act of Toleration and other things have happened in England. So obviously, the Catholic Church is legally recognized, and they're not the same kind of prejudices.
Church of England is funded through your tax.
Right. I mean, that's yeah. And I don't know the percentage of people. I know that in terms of active attendees and participants in the Church of England, it's a small percentage, 10 to 15%. But there's something of a revival going on in England among young people. And the other thing, a lot of immigrants who are coming to England, we hear about the Muslim immigration, but a lot of the international people coming to England are also already Christian, particularly from Africa, and they're actually leading some of the revival that's going on in England. It's just, again, multifaceted, very interesting. I'm sure I've made reference to the surprising rebirth of belief in God. It's a podcast series that I'm listening to, and it's really fascinating. So, okay, well, I've kept you past time. So now, I guess question, I can do a little bit next week on how Methodism connects to all this. We can kind of close up the shop that way, and then go to looking at Old Testament prophecy, or do you want to just go to prophecy next week?
Add the Methodists in.
Okay, we'll do that. So we'll take 1 week on Methodism, and I'll make the connections to this story, and then we'll carry on. Okay. We'll see you next week.
All right. Good night.
Bye-bye.